Chapter 23, Respiratory Physiology, Screencast 4. The topic of this screencast will actually be gas exchange, so keep in mind there is a significant difference between transport and exchange. This will focus on exchange, and remember, we'll be looking at the movement of gases down their partial pressure gradient. Now, it's important us to understand the concept of partial pressure, and when we talk about what that means, it is the pressure exerted by each gas within a mixture of gases, and it is expressed in millimeters of mercury. Each gas will move independently down its partial pressure gradient during gas exchange. When we look at atmospheric pressure, as noted before at sea level, it is 760 millimeters of mercury. The total pressure of all gases collectively exert in the environment and add up to 760 millimeters. The primary gases are going to be nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, and other minor gases. Now here, if we look at the partial pressure, it's going to be the percentage of gas over what the atmospheric pressure is. So nitrogen is 78.6% of the gas in air. 760 millimeters times 78.6 or 0.786 is 597 millimeters of mercury, and that is the partial pressure of nitrogen. As noted before, partial pressures added together equal the total atmospheric pressure. This is known as Dalton's law, and it's important to keep in mind that this is given for a certain temperature. Now here we can basically look at oxygen across the board, okay? Or various gases. So here we can actually see at sea level, the partial pressure of nitrogen is 597. When we look at oxygen, oxygen accounts for 20.9% of the air, and that will be 159 millimeters of mercury. But let's take a look at overall what happens to oxygen at various levels. If we look at below sea level, we're actually going to be looking at a significantly greater partial pressure of oxygen because of what the atmospheric pressure is. Atmospheric pressure is 1,520 millimeters of mercury. We multiply that by 0.209, and that will give us 318 millimeters of mercury. If we look at altitude, we can see a corresponding decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen. So at 10,000 feet above sea level, we have a partial pressure of 523 millimeters of mercury. We multiply that by 0.209, and that gives us 110 millimeters of mercury. So keep in mind what's happening with altitude. With altitude, we see a significant decrease in atmospheric pressure, so there will be a corresponding decrease in the concentration or the overall amount of each gas. Now, when we look at partial pressures within the body, a couple of things to keep in mind. And it is important to realize that partial pressure in the alveoli is different from atmospheric partial pressure. Air from the environment mixes with air remaining in anatomic dead space. Oxygen diffuses out of the alveoli into the blood. Carbon dioxide diffuses from blood into the alveoli. Also, more water vapor is present in the alveoli than in atmosphere. Within alveoli, and this is an important relationship to keep in mind here, the percentage and partial pressure of oxygen are lower than in the atmosphere. Percentage and partial pressure of CO2 are higher than in the atmosphere. And when we look at the overall partial pressure of our respiratory gases, they will maintain normally constant. In systemic cells, partial pressures of gases reflect cellular respiration, and that involves the use of oxygen and the production of CO2. The percentage of oxygen lower and CO2 higher than in the alveoli. Under resting normal conditions, partial pressures are remaining constant. In circulating blood, gas partial pressures are not constant. O2 enters blood in the pulmonary capillaries, and carbon dioxide leaves. O2 leaves blood in systemic capillaries, CO2 enters. Here we basically see the overall pattern, okay, and note as far as the differences in partial pressure, and I'm just going to concentrate here on oxygen. If we look at the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere at sea level, it's about 159 millimeters of mercury. And then if we look at what's happening within the pulmonary capillaries, we can actually see what the partial pressure of oxygen is within the alveolus. It's about 104. And then we're actually going to look at what it is within the red blood cell. And that is going to result in transfer or movement of partial pressure of gas from high partial pressure to low partial pressure from the alveolus onto the capillary. We'll look at this in a lot more detail as we move through. Don't worry about memorizing these numbers. As I indicated previously, be able to predict the directionality of gases in the directions you expect them to go in. You know they're already going from high partial pressure to low partial pressure, so that really takes care of itself, and that is the most important thing to keep in mind. Now, as noted, partial pressure gradients, they exist when the pressure for a gas is higher in one region of the respiratory system than another. Gas will move from a region of high partial pressure to an area of low partial pressure until equilibrium has been reached. Both types of gas exchange will depend on gradients. There are two different types of gas exchange. We are looking at alveolar gas exchange, and that is going to be between the blood in our pulmonary capillaries and the alveoli, whereas systemic gas exchange will be between blood and systemic capillaries and systemic cells. Now, another principle that we have to keep in mind here is the solubility of a gas. Now, Henry's law basically says at a given temperature, the solubility of a gas in liquid is dependent upon the partial pressure of the gas in the air and the solubility coefficient of the gas in the liquid. Now, partial pressure is the driving force moving gas into liquid, and it's going to be determined by the total pressure and percentage of gas in the mixture. For example, CO2 is forced into soft drinks under high pressure, hence the carbonation. Solubility coefficient, that is the volume of gas that dissolves in a specified volume of liquid at a given temperature and pressure. A constant that depends upon interactions between molecules of the gas and liquid. Now, gases vary in their solubility in water. Now, one thing is especially important, and this is something that I want you to be comfortable with. Carbon dioxide is about 24 times as soluble as oxygen. What that is telling us is carbon dioxide can actually be dissolved in our plasma, oxygen cannot. Now, nitrogen is about half as soluble as oxygen. It does not normally dissolve in blood in significant amounts. Now, gases with low solubility require larger pressure gradients to push the gas into the liquid. This is what happens with decompression sickness or the bends. Now, this is a phenomenon that occurs when a diver is submerged in water beyond a certain depth and returns too quickly to the surface. Nitrogen is forced into the blood due to the higher pressure. Dissolved nitrogen bubbles out of solution while still in blood and tissues, and this has to be treated with a hyperbaric chamber. The partial pressure gradient for oxygen is increased. Additional oxygen can dissolve in blood plasma, and this is a treatment that is used for other disorders such as carbon monoxide poisoning. Now here, this is an overview of gas exchange, and we are looking at basically tissue gas exchange or alveolar gas exchange. Once again, we're not focusing on the numbers, and we're going to look at a number of individual images to kind of go through this. Now, these numbers are not meant to be memorized. They're being used as an example so that you can actually see the movement of gases until equilibrium is reached. The partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli is about 104 millimeters of mercury. The partial pressure of oxygen of blood entering pulmonary capillaries is 40 millimeters of mercury. So what that is telling us, oxygen diffuses across the respiratory membrane from the alveoli into the capillaries down its partial pressure gradient. And this will continue until blood PO2 is equal to that of the alveoli. Levels in the alveoli remain pretty constant as fresh air is continuously entering the lungs. When we look at CO2, the partial pressure of CO2 in the alveoli is 40 millimeters of mercury, whereas the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood of pulmonary capillaries is 45 millimeters of mercury. Carbon dioxide will diffuse from blood into the alveoli. It's moving down its partial pressure gradient, and once again, it will continue until blood levels equal alveoli levels, and levels in alveoli once again remain constant as they do with oxygen. Here's what this diagram is telling us. So we have one diagram that's basically combining the two, showing us the directionality. And keep in mind, here's the alveolus, here's our respiratory membrane, and here's our red blood cell. We can see oxygen going from high partial pressure to a lower partial pressure onto the red blood cell, and carbon dioxide is going to be moving in the opposite direction. Now let's take a look at what's actually happening individually with PO2 and PCO2. So notice the partial pressure of oxygen on that red blood cell as it's moving in this direction. So kind of imagine we're starting here and we're going to move across the capillary. If we look at where we're starting, we're going to have a partial pressure of 104, and the starting partial pressure of oxygen on the red blood cell is 40. Look what happens. Basically, we see exchange occurring between the alveolus and the red blood cells until we reach an equilibrium, and now the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is 104 millimeters of mercury. Now it's backwards when we look at CO2. We look at CO2 as it's entering, has a partial pressure of 45 millimeters of mercury. We look at the partial pressure within the alveolus. Basically, we will see this partial pressure or exchange of CO2 until we've reached an equilibrium. So here, we're actually looking at CO2 being unloaded into the alveolus. Now, when we're looking at things that contribute to gas exchange, especially at the respiratory membrane, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. Some are going to be anatomical features, and some are going to be physiological features. The anatomical features consist of a large surface area for gas exchange, approximately 70 square meters, and the other thing that is facilitating exchange of gases is the minimal thickness of the respiratory membrane, and it's only about half a micrometer. Now, when we look at physiological adjustments, this is known as ventilation-perfusion coupling. This is the ability of bronchioles to regulate airflow and arterioles to regulate blood flow. Ventilation is going to be changed by bronchodilation or bronchoconstriction. For example, dilation will happen in response to increased PCO2 of air in the bronchiole. Perfusion will change by pulmonary arterial dilation or constriction. For example, dilation in response to either a decreased PCO2 or an increased PO2 within the blood. So let's kind of take a look at this as far as the changes in the bronchioles versus the changes in the pulmonary arterioles. So here we're basically looking what is going to result in the dilation of the bronchioles. An increased PCO2 in the air within the bronchioles will result in dilation of the bronchiole. Now, if we have a decreased PCO2 of the air within the bronchiole, we'll actually see a bronchial constriction or bronchoconstriction. Now here we're looking at what's happening to the arterioles. If we look at an increased PO2 or decreased PCO2 in the blood, our arterioles are going to dilate, whereas a decreasing PO2 or increased PCO2 in the blood will result in constriction of the arterioles. Now here, when we look at emphysema, and what emphysema does, it creates an irreversible loss of pulmonary gas exchange surface area. And basically, there's an inflammation of air passageways that are distal to the terminal bronchioles, and there's a widespread destruction of pulmonary elastic connective tissue. This results in dilation and decreased total number of alveoli. So now, because of the loss of this pulmonary elastic connective tissue, they have an inability to expire effectively. They've lost the ability to recoil. In most cases, the primary cause of emphysema is due to smoking. Now, when we look at some other impacts of respiratory diseases that impact the efficiency of pulmonary gas exchange, we can see that certain diseases will decrease the efficiency of oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. This is due to the decreased number of alveoli. For example, lung cancer is a really good example of this. What happens due to a thickened respiratory membrane? For example, this will occur for congestive heart failure. There also could be changes in the ventilation-perfusion coupling, and this is something that might occur with asthma or pulmonary embolism. Overall, diseases result in decreased blood partial pressure of oxygen in the blood and an increased partial pressure of CO2. Now we have to look at tissue gas exchange, and basically this is going to be relatively similar. Oxygen diffuses out of systemic capillaries to enter systemic cells. Partial pressures, once again, are driving the process. The partial pressure of oxygen in systemic cells is about 40 millimeters of mercury, whereas the partial pressure of oxygen in systemic capillaries is about 95 millimeters of mercury. And once again, this will continue until the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is 40 millimeters of mercury. And once again, we are looking at a relatively constant systemic cell PO2 overall. And once again, generally, oxygen will be delivered at the same rate it is used, unless we're looking at a situation which involves strenuous exercise. CO2, now we're looking at CO2 moving from systemic cells into the blood. Once again, partial pressure gradients are driving the process. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in systemic cells is 45 millimeters of mercury. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in systemic capillaries is 40 millimeters of mercury. Diffusion will continue until an equilibrium is reached of 45 millimeters of mercury in the blood. Here, this is very similar to the diagram that we saw previously that was looking at alveolar gas exchange. Now we're just looking at tissue gas exchange. And remember, once again, it's the directionality of the gases. And remember, oxygen will be moving into the tissue. CO2 will be moving out of the tissue into the blood. So let's take a look at this here. So we see this partial pressure of oxygen in this arterial, about 100 millimeters of mercury. We look at what it is in the tissue, and so oxygen will be unloaded into the cell following its partial pressure gradient until equilibrium of 40 has been reached. CO2 will be moving in the opposite direction. It's going to be moving out of the tissue into the blood down its partial pressure gradient until we actually see equilibrium reached once again. So here we look at the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, 45 millimeters of mercury in a systemic cell, and it will reach an equilibrium on the CO2 in the blood.